we have folks out there like yourself and your team who have a very specific set of expertise that we can lean on. And it doesn't mean that we have to lean on it every day, but in the times that we need it. And so that I think is really exciting. So again, it's sort of the theme of this entire conversation is sort of getting out of our silo and finding all these opportunities. What have you found kind of in this space? Is it a gradual adoption, or are people kind of rushing towards this shared services? What do you think?
I think it was gradual, perhaps until we hit the pandemic timeframe. So we were pretty slow. So we're hitting our 10th year this year. And it was slow, at least for me. People were slow to grab the idea and run with it. But now I see it's faster and faster. And people are like, gosh, this is a great idea. I can hand off to you 5-10 hours a week, and then I can do what's more important for my part of the flight department. Hello, and welcome to the Business Aviation Collective podcast, sponsored by LD Aviation. I'm Lindsay, your host, and today we get a chance to talk to Dylan Miller, who is currently the lead captain on the Challenger 350 for a Part 91 flight department, but probably he's best known for his 21.5 podcast, which is great. He also just rotated off as one of the co-chairs for the small flight department, which if you've listened before, I think that's a really cool group, and I'd like to talk about that. So, hello, Dylan.
Hi, Lindsay. It's nice to be on the receiving end of the microphone for once and not have to ask any of the questions.
That's right. Well, great. Well, I'm so excited to pick your brain, and I really want to talk about your podcast, but I'm going to do that a little bit further down the line. And today I'd like to start off with, how did you get into aviation? Looks like you've been a pilot, and how did you start?
Yeah. For me, it was kind of just right place, right time situation. So I grew up in a really small town on the Oregon coast of about 5,000 people, and there just happened to be an airport just down the street from me. And my folks one day were saying, I used to play baseball as a kid, and they're like, you need to do more than just play baseball. So we need to get you out of the house doing something else. And one of the women at our church is a flight instructor, and do you want to take flying lessons from her? And I said, okay. And I was 14 at the time. And so I hopped on my bicycle and rode the mile down to the airport and did my first lesson in a 152. And I was like, this is really cool. Mm-hmm. And so kind of got after it at a young age at 14. And, I watched an interesting video the other day about someone that was talking about teaching children about golf. And he says, one of the main reasons a lot of good tour players are good golfers is because we didn't have a lot of options when we were kids. It was the golf course was the only thing down the street. And it was kind of the same for me. It was like the airport was down the street. I lived in a small town of 5,000 people. There weren't a ton of different things to do. But fortunately, aviation was one of them. And it was just down the road. So I started at an early age, did flight training. It was on the Oregon coast, so the weather wasn't always great. So that was a little bit of a challenge. But on the days where it was clear, it was incredible to be able to fly up and down the Oregon coast. If anyone's been there,
I love that area.
Yeah, it's spectacular. So super cool to learn there. And then again, kind of not because I had a ton of options, but had a flight instructor later on when I was in high school, did my solo and everything. My flight instructor at one point said, if you want to go do this as a career, there's a school called Embry-Riddle where you can go to college and you can be a professional pilot. I said, well, that sounds good. And so I went and toured that school. It was the only school I toured. It was the only college I applied to, and kind of didn't really know any better or know any other options. This was sort of in the 90s. The internet was maybe just getting going. So there wasn't I didn't have anyone in aviation in my family that was like a mentor that could be like, oh, there's all these different options. Or it was sort of like, well, I guess this is Embry-Riddle. I saw a pamphlet and so off I went.
Cool. All right.
Yeah. And so it was sort of, again, didn't have too many choices. So it was easy in a way because I just kind of plowed ahead. Off to Embry-Riddle, start in the early 2000s, and really excited to get there and start flying. But there was this instructor crunch. They couldn't find enough instructors. And so we were kind of grounded for a semester waiting. And then finally, fall of 2001, it's time to start flying. So excited to get in the airplanes there. They're a big fleet of airplanes, very professional operation. And I think maybe, what did I get? 2 flights accomplished. And then if you remember, in the fall of 2001, we had September 11th. And that slowed things down for quite a bit. So it was, you go to aviation school to learn all about aviation and the principles and and the rules and aerodynamics and all this. But probably the best first lesson in aviation was timing is super important, right? And
Yeah.
and so you learn like, oh man, September 11th, that this big external macro factor has this big impact on me and my career and what's going to happen. And so that was kind of a good lesson to learn at an early age, was like, wow, it's not just how hard I study in school and how good of a pilot I am, but what is going on in the globe, what's going on in the financial world. All these different things have a bearing on your career. That was kind of lesson number one.
Did you ever think that you might not go back to flying? Because in that time, people were saying, oh, nobody's going to fly again. And, nobody needs pilots. And
no, I think I was fortunate that I was so early on I would think I was still working on my private certificate.
Yeah.
So it was it wasn't like I was ready to go get a job. So I still had that. I was fortunate that I had, 4 or 5 years of kind of training and education to go through.
Got it.
So that wasn't really the immediate thought, but
okay.
Certainly there were people that were, about to make the jump to the regional airlines or what have you. And they did experience that slowdown. So timing, again, as you and I both know in this industry, is pretty much seems like about 90% of what happens to you.
It sure is.
So after kind of we got through 9/11, and then I was able to sort of kind of resume a normal track at Embry-Riddle, and I did take advantage of their flight training, which was incredible. But I learned a real valuable lesson when I was there, and I didn't know it at the time, but it's the value of networking in aviation, right? And when people ask me, should I go to an aviation university? Should I do this? That's kind of the differentiator for me now is, will you be able to leverage some of the less obvious benefits that you get from the school, which is all of the people that you drank beer with on Friday and Saturday nights, they're probably going to be in your industry in 20 years, right? And so you thought you were just having fun and mountain biking and screwing around and doing whatever, but it turns out that now all those folks are people that are lifelong friends of yours that are in industry, especially if you choose business aviation. And so that was a huge benefit of going to that aviation school versus just a regular university. So
that's a really great point. And it's so funny you say that now, is because I'm going to Palm Springs for the leadership conference next week. Well, a person I graduated college with in our aviation school happens to be the airport manager for Palm Springs. So I'm going to go down and check it out. You're right. It's been 20 some years since I've been to college, but our friends are still in the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. People, I think, tend to stay in aviation. They may not stay in the, some that went as pilots may have transitioned to something else, or maybe, but they typically stay in aviation. It's so infectious for some reason.
It is.
It's amazing now to look back and think about all of the people that I went to school with and where they are now, and how much I've used that and leveraged that. So one other kind of observation I make now that I didn't know at the time, but I got lucky. I took what I would call a high visibility on campus job. And so what that was for me was what we called a flight dispatcher on the flight line. But basically students would come check in and they would get the keys to the airplane, and you'd say, oh, okay, you go to this practice area and here's your airplane, number 75 or whatever. So to me at the time, I was like, I'm a student. This will be fun. I like airplanes. I'm going to be at the airport. I'm going to see my friends. And that's kind of about as much thought as I put into it. And, oh, by the way, I'm going to make $5 an hour or whatever. But what I didn't realize is, now every single person that's a flight student is coming to check in, and they're seeing me. And so now I know they're the name, and we converse. And now all of a sudden I'm walking through campus and I'm saying hi to everybody because I know everybody, because they're all coming to check in at the front desk.
Sure.
So another sort of like lucky break for networking. But, often when I talk to students now, and they say, what can I do to increase my network while I'm in school? And I say, number one, a public-facing on-campus job is a great way to meet people especially for a lot of pilots who are introverts and wouldn't normally meet people. This is a great way to meet folks. And number two, and this is kind of the actual secret sauce that I figured out, not only do you want to network with your peers, but you actually want to network with people that are about 2 years ahead of you. because they're the folks that are going to be leading into industry. And then once they have their jobs, then they're going to be the people that are going to be writing you the letters of recommendation to bring you on to their company. So as a flight dispatcher, I was working a lot with the flight instructors, and most of the flight instructors were flight students who had then graduated up to be the flight instructor. And then guess what? Their next job's at the regional airline.
Yep.
And so now, come time for me to be a flight instructor at Embry-Riddle, I'm teaching. I have dozens of folks that already know me and can provide a reference for me that are at the regional airlines. Then it's a very easy step to move up. So that's a couple of steps I always tell students that are in an aviation program.
Great.
Easy way to get ahead. And it doesn't even really feel, it's not a forced networking thing, because it's very natural, because you're working and you're interacting with these folks already. And versus like trying to go into a room with a suit and tie and, hand business cards out. That never really works, in my opinion, but that can be a way that you can leverage some of those opportunities. And you can do that. It doesn't have to be at an aviation university, right? It could be at Part 61 flight school or any flight school, but same applies.
Or even like any volunteer place, right?
Sure.
I mean, you could be even if it's MBAA YoPro, you're the person there maybe taking you're at the door, making sure everybody has what they need. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep. And so that's the lesson there from the university, aside from all the traditional training. Yes, we know you're going to learn how to fly and you're going to go through all the classes and that kind of stuff. And that's sort of a given, but really that networking piece is so key early on. And then sort of the next piece of advice, again, I don't want to make this sound like I'm some sort of genius that's got all the chess pieces that I'm making moves. I kind of got lucky in a lot of respects, but my first job, kind of first real professional pilot job, was at a company called American Eagle, not clothing
I totally
company.
know them.
Yeah, the regional airline. And my mentors kind of recommended that I go there. At the time, it was not the most obvious choice because it didn't have a very quick upgrade and some other things that sort of didn't make it appealing. But what they did have was an incredible training program. And they had, because they were owned by American Airlines, they had adopted a lot of the policies, procedures, and techniques that American Airlines used. And so American Eagle was kind of regarded as maybe the best place to learn how to fly an airplane. And so that first job, I think, is so key to build your foundation when it comes to learning about how to fly in a structured program. And it teaches you a lot of discipline. It teaches you sort of the best practices of the industry. How do I do call outs? How do I work with an operations manual? How do I work with a dispatcher? All of those things that you may not get if you're just going to fly that King Air down on the street as a flight instructor. Not that that's a bad move, but if you can get those principles early on and build that incredible foundation, that's going to serve you no matter where you go. So another thing that we always encourage folks right after flight instructing is go to a really established operator for that first level of experience. That could be NetJets. That could be a regional airline. It could be a 135 operator with a lot of airplanes, but somewhere where there is some, I don't want to say strictness, but there's definitely some framework there so that they can kind of mold you into what a professional pilot is. Again, I just got lucky that that's what I happened to do. Didn't think about it at the time, but that was kind of my path. And so, yeah, go ahead.
I have a quick question. So I want to kind of bring this up because it also, I think, has something to do with the small flight department to a committee that you work with, because there's, if I'm not mistaken, like Embry-Riddle, now they do it, but years ago, and even some of these smaller flight schools are not necessarily talking a lot about these safety management systems. And like you're saying, if you go into a structured place, most often a safety management system is going to be in place and you learn how to work within that.
Yeah.
Whereas when you go to some of the smaller flight departments, oftentimes those are not there. So you haven't learned it maybe in flight school, and now you're not learning it in your first job. And anyway, I just thought that was a really cool.
It is. And that's one of the things in the small flight department that we look at is folks have been operating for many years without an SMS. Say, we're just fine. We don't need this, and it's one of those, I don't know if, I hate to say it's the old dog learning new tricks kind of a thing, but in some ways it is. And yes, that was much easier for people with a background in the larger operations. I mean, it's funny. I'll give you an example right now. All of the folks with an airline background that are now flying business aviation are demanding for ASAP programs at their operators.
Yeah.
But nobody in business aviation that hasn't been in a big operator doesn't get it. They don't understand what an ASAP program is. They don't understand the value. They don't understand the protections that it gives the pilots because they never operated it. Right. They just think all they see is this is paperwork. This is going to be more difficult. Somebody's looking over my shoulder. What is the incentive for me? And so there is definitely some things that you learn about at those larger operators. It's a really good point.
Yeah. Yep. Cool. Anyway, I said I kind of hijacked you there. Okay.
Yeah.
So
no. So I built the foundation at American Eagle. We tell folks, and this number may vary a little bit, it's kind of a race to get to 3,000 hours, in my opinion. Once you get to 3,000 hours, you can kind of do what you want. 3,000 seems to be, and it could change a little bit. It might be 2,500, it might be 3,500, but it just in your career allows you to kind of pivot, and you've got that body of work that you can say, listen, I've seen at 3,000 hours, especially if you're flying a turbine airplane, you've probably seen about most things that people can throw at you, right? Bad weather, flying in and out of busy airports, probably a little bit of international flying. So sort of the foundation has been built. So for me, that's kind of what I did. I built that foundation. I always wanted to be involved in business aviation. That's kind of always was the allure to me. I stayed connected to some friends that were in business aviation. And so I made the transition over after flying an American Eagle for a few years and started to do business aviation. I was hooked on that and kind of have been with it ever since. And so I started off flying beach jets and did King Airs and Challengers and sort of the whole gamut of experience there. But I think right now is an interesting thing to look at is a lot of folks in business aviation are stuck with a very difficult decision, especially if they've never flown airlines before. And that's like, should I stay in business aviation or should I go work for a major airline, right? Because the money is getting very good to go work in a major.
Right.
And I feel fortunate that I did get that opportunity to fly for a big operator and fly at an airline. And I figured out what that was like. And so many of my peers in business aviation that never did that, right now they're struggling because they've really got is the grass greener type of a question. And they don't know for themselves. And I feel very fortunate that I did experience that. I flew at the airlines. It was great. I got some great experience there, but I know that that's not really what I'm interested in doing for the next 25 years. And I appreciate and enjoy the differences that business aviation has to offer. So I feel very fortunate that I got to see that difference, and which is another reason why we encourage folks, try a few different things when you're young, and it's a little bit easier, and then you can sort of have more confidence in your decision later on, I guess.
Sure. That totally makes sense.
Yeah. So I kind of got a good opportunity to see a lot of different business aviation. The cool thing about business aviation is there's so much variety that's available, right? You can do charter, you can do Part 91. Every owner that you or account or principal that you work for is different. So, you can fly a Challenger 350 for somebody that only takes it, to Mexico every couple of weekends, or you can fly for the same airplane for a company that uses it, 4 days a week to transport people to their offices or mines or whatever. Yep. So, there's lots of variety there. And the other nice thing about business aviation is that I find it to be a little bit more, I don't want to say accommodating, but you're able to change your path and your trajectory a little bit easier at the airlines where you're stuck on the seniority list.
Yeah.
You and I both have children, and we've experienced what life is like probably in our 20s. and in our 30s, and you're raising children, and now maybe you're in your 40s. And it's like these different decades have different jobs that fit within there. So when I have young children, maybe it's great to be home every night and be able to go to baseball practice and do that kind of stuff. But maybe in my 50s, I'll want to go fly that Gulfstream International, and being on the road for 2 weeks isn't going to be as big of a deal. So I like it in business aviation. You have the ability to pivot quickly to a completely different experience. So instead of saying, well, I was on the seniority list at Delta for 35 years and it was great and I was taken care of, but it maybe was not the most exciting thing, if you're confident in yourself and you're not afraid to kind of put yourself out there, you could look back at a career in business aviation and say, well, for 6 years I flew the King Air, and then for 5 years I did a Challenger, and then I was in a Gulfstream, and then I went back to, an Embraer. You can kind of have a little bit more variety, which I think to me is a little bit more interesting because it's sort of that new challenge that you tackle.
You bet. And not only different airplanes, but you can do things like your small flight department co-chair. And I also see you were the president of the Arizona Business Aviation Association. I think while in the airlines, I'm sure there's some maybe safety captain opportunities and things like that. But there's a wealth of opportunities in business aviation in so many different sections.
Yeah, absolutely. That's well put. Business aviation can be so exciting for the right type of individual, the person that likes to get involved, the person that likes to network, the person that likes to work with other people. There's really an unlimited amount of opportunity to be involved. NBAA, of course, has many opportunities. And then your local aviation group has tons of opportunities as well. That's kind of a big piece of the advice that I give folks. If you're going to stick it out in business aviation for the long term, one, you better enjoy networking. You better enjoy meeting other people because really the protection that you get on a seniority list is pretty much can't be beat at the airlines, right?
Yeah.
So really the only comparable thing you can do is having a really strong network in business aviation so that, if there's a new opportunity or one opportunity ends, you've got the network around you to reach out and find that next thing. And one of the great ways that you do that is by being involved in these different organizations. The local level stuff is great because you're meeting folks that in all aspects of aviation in your area. You never know who is going to be an incredible resource later on. Just a quick example, when I was serving as the president of the Arizona chapter, one of our board members was she ran the local office for the rental car company.
Okay.
Great board member, very involved. But on the surface as a pilot, you might think, do I really need to nurture a relationship with this person with the rental car company? They might not see the value in that. And later on, and we got to work together on a lot of items on the board. And it turned out that it became a very beneficial relationship for both of us in ways that we didn't expect because, this person that's renting a car says he might need a pilot. And then all of a sudden, and so you're sort of referring business back and forth, and it may not be obvious in the moment, but it's interesting where that will pay dividends later on.
Yeah. I think that's the key point too. Yeah. It may not be obvious in the moment. You may not know why you're baking and cultivating that relationship, but you just never know where that's going to come back and just be a real asset to you.
Exactly. So that was kind of an eye-opening experience there. And just from the couple of years I served as president several years ago, I'm still reaping the rewards of those relationships. And so it's great. That part is very rewarding to be involved. At the time, it can be tough, especially when you're telling your spouse, "Oh, sorry, we got to go to a meeting here, and I'm sorry, I've got two crying kids at home, but I've got to go, package up toys for tots or something, or some type of volunteer event." But it is always a balance, but certainly worthwhile. And then I think at the larger level, Lindsay, I know you've been involved with NBAA before. It's amazing how many different committees they have. And pretty much no matter what you're involved in, you can find a place to get plugged in there. And that's exciting. And I think what I'd be curious to get your take on, I was involved in the Small Flight Department Committee, and Small Flight Department make up about 80% of the NBAA members, which is their, one or two aircraft operations, which is kind of what you think of in the traditional business aviation standpoint. And it's wonderful. That's where I'm at now. I really enjoy that. But there are challenges that we have there. And a lot of it is we're all trying to reinvent the wheel, right? Because in the past, all these small flight departments have sort of been siloed. So we do it our way, and then the guy in the hangar next to us, they do it their way, and then she does it their way, because that's the way we've always done it. And so there hasn't been a great mechanism to share a lot of best practices. And honestly, I don't think a lot of folks have really desired to share best practices, right? It's not been a real high.
Totally agree with that. I really think that's a good point. For so long, everybody's just been keeping all their information to themselves. I see that seems to be changing now, but I mean, I just remember being in flight departments and we didn't even tell the main office that there was a flight department. We were trying to keep ourselves secret. which again is not so much the case these days. But I think that statistics that you popped out too is really important for people to understand. 80%, think about that, 80% of the flight departments are small flight departments, the 1 and 2 aircraft operators. The larger ones that we all know about are great flight departments as well. But yeah, how do we get the really great practices that maybe are being benchmarked in these large flight departments to trickle down into the small flight departments?
Yeah. And that's what we've been trying to tackle on this with the small flight department committee is how can we share information? How can we share resources? And obviously, I think that the saying comes to mind, when the student is ready, the master will appear. And, meaning, if the director of the department isn't interested in doing any of this, then nothing's going to happen. But I think more and more folks are becoming more interested in these best practices. And we just have so many more great shared resources. ProPilotWorld.com is great. You can log in there and ask a question and get really, really high quality information from people that have been in the business for a really long time. There's Facebook groups out there, good and bad, but the ones that are aircraft specific in general. So like, for example, I'm in the Challenger 300, 350 group. If I have a question about the airplane, that's where I can almost always get the fastest response. I can quickly post a picture of whatever's going on. And you might be thinking, this guy's going to Facebook for maintenance advice. Well, no, not necessarily, but there are a lot of times where you can get you can tap into the hive mind, so to speak, and get really good information. Oh, I can't get the monitor on in the back of the airplane. What's the reset procedure, whatever. So a lot of great research sources there. And then, of course, the small flight department committee, what we're doing a lot of is creating kind of like webinars that you can tune into anytime we record, and we'll say, what are the best practices for maintenance? Oh, I'm going to a heavy inspection and it's just me. I don't know anything. The chief pilot just went to Delta Airlines. I'm the new chief pilot. I've never sent an airplane into a heavy inspection. What do I do? Well, we talked to some directors of maintenance and some folks that give you the steps to say, hey, here's the 10 things you should do when you're going into a heavy inspection. And, oh, what about these LOAs? I don't understand. And this is too much, Okay, well, here are the resources that we can talk to about the process. So we've tried to create a little bit of that. And so we're excited about those types of opportunities to share with folks to kind of break down some of the walls and help. And then I would say this is a really key right now, where when business aviation is losing folks to the airlines, one of the products that NBAA is bringing to market, and there are some other vendors, is these salary surveys. And that's super important right now. I think, do they even touch on scheduler and dispatcher compensation in those too, the NBAA?
They do. Yeah. And my only thing I would say about that, and because I really like to do it, is there's very little participation, because oftentimes it's the larger flight departments that are participating in general in these salary surveys. And the other thing is that for us, we do not participate. We do employ 16 schedulers, but we do not own an aircraft. So if you do not own an aircraft, you can't really participate in those. So while I love those, and yes, they are helpful, I think they're not giving, at least for the scheduler dispatcher side, they're not giving enough range of what is actually going on in the market.
Absolutely. That's a really good point. And I wasn't aware of some of that in the non-pilot side.
Yeah.
But there are those tools, and I think they're getting better. There's another one called the Air Comp Calculator that's out there as well.
I heard of that.
Yeah. And that's another great tool that's out there. But I think kind of in general, we've got to break down the walls right now. I get it. In the past, it tried to be more of a closely kept secret. What are we paying our pilots? And we don't want to say. I think that time is gone, because we're in a fight for talent now.
Yeah.
And we can't afford to sit there and lose all of these talented people just because a director of aviation doesn't want to have a difficult conversation or really take an introspective look at what's going on. I would say that's the toughest part about being in business aviation right now, is seeing all of the folks that we're losing that we don't have to lose.
Yep.
But it's like the only way that change comes is when somebody leaves at this point.
Yeah.
And it's like, and it's like, okay. And it happens at every department now too. So that department has to lose somebody for them to look and see, are we competitive? And then another department has to wait and to lose somebody. And then they think about, so it's always retroactive. It's always reactive. And it's a shame that it has to be that way. I don't know if that's ever going to change. It might just be the way it goes in this business, but hopefully the walls will continue to break down and we can kind of stop having to all learn the same lesson individually, because that does slow progress down a little bit.
Yep, I agree. And I wouldn't mind adding an additional point, at least for the scheduler dispatcher side, where we still see a lot of people who think the scheduler dispatcher is really just an admin position. And I would argue it is not, and it's part of your safety program, like it's keeping you safe. I am seeing that change though, and I'm seeing people starting to be paid based on the fact that they're really a part of the team. They're not just the admin over here that's doing papers. So I am seeing a change. It's slow, but I do think it's progressing correctly, slowly, but progressing.
Okay. I can't help that, but my podcast host is coming out of me, but I want to ask you a question now.
Yeah, go ahead.
We're seeing technology is increasing. AI is on the horizon. The tools are getting better now for flight planning, for analysis, for monitoring. In 10 years from now, where do you see the dispatcher scheduler role being? How is it going to evolve and how's it going to adapt?
Oh, that's an awesome question. I love all of the technology that's coming up because it is streamlining our, I would say, a large majority of communication. I think that's going to be changing. So gone are going to be these days where we have to email everything back and forth. That's going to be changing and getting less cumbersome. I don't think that the scheduler dispatcher position is ever going to go away, partly because of the high-end customer service that is part of the aviation industry. Now, I could see where we're going to be more efficient, but then as we're more efficient, that allows that dispatcher to become more part of the crew by going in and checking NOTAMs. Like you have companies like Polaris who will pull in all of that NOTAM information and starting to color code it and put it in plain language. So that means for the dispatcher, it's easier to help funnel that information to the crew, the pilot. So I don't see that position ever going away. I see it changing though. And I think it's just changing in a great way because it's going to be more safety and technology focused.
Yeah.
I'm excited actually for it because I love those pieces of it. I actually love all of the details and the technology and all the little data pieces that we're looking at on the flight planning side and the weight and balance side. So I think it's great for our industry.
Yeah. And, it's coming, whether we want it or not. That part is true. And, you look off into the future as far as you want and you could see, will there be humans in aviation at all? Who knows in 100 years? But you mentioned it's that customer service. And that's really what is very difficult to duplicate. We've said oftentimes, the robot could probably get the airplane to Teterboro, but good luck making sure the rental car's there and getting them into the transportation and all that stuff, and dealing with all of those problems. So it'll be interesting to see. And you mentioned Polaris, and we use one of their products called Flight Risk, which looks at it. What's cool about it, and this is where I see a lot of kind of breaking down the walls and sharing information coming in. They let you import the best practices from like regional groups. So you can have, I think they demoed like the Northeast operators group or something like that. And so it had specific notes and advice for certain airports. Oh, hey, there's a noise abatement thing here. Oh, you can't take off after this time. Or, hey, we really don't recommend you do this. And it's stuff that we would never, especially as an Arizona-based operator, I would never have access to that information, or, I would really have to be plugged in to find that. So those are encouraging signs of sharing that and type of information.
I totally agree. And we're looking at some of that as well. And if we can funnel some of those details and check on them prior to sending a flight out as the dispatcher, I think that's just another win for the flight department in general.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Those are great options.
Yeah.
Okay. So I kind of want to switch a little bit. We talked about like your aviation and your flying that you're doing. Where did the 21.5 podcast come from? You've been doing it for over 5 years. Just something you like to do? How'd you get into that?
Yeah, I think at its core, my colleague and I, Max, my co-host, we had a lot of conversations. We were both Part 91 operators. Mm-hmm. And in Part 91, as you know, there isn't a lot of required training to stay up on what's going on, right? So yes, we have to go to the recurrent training once a year, but that's pretty much mostly airplane specific stuff. But a lot of the regulatory things, a lot of the best practices, that's on you to stay up on that. And so we would have conversations. Hey, what are you doing here? What are you doing this? What's the best practice here? And so we have these conversations, and we thought, this could be valuable to share with a larger audience. How can we help folks and kind of give back a little bit? And so we started that in 2019, bought the crappy microphone on Amazon and just kind of like everybody else, and started recording and sharing things. And again, I think part of it was we have both had expertise in business aviation, which, as we've talked about before, very siloed. A lot of that information is kind of closely guarded. There's no great source for it. Yep. And the other thing that we did is we had some mentors in the podcast space, and what they said was focus on a niche. Don't try and do the aviation show that covers every, airline news and, this and that and a million different angles. Pick your lane and then just do that. And so we said, well, there's really no show just for professional pilots. There's a lot of aviation shows. You can listen about, what fighter pilots are doing or what the AOPA's got, or there's a lot of great information. But for the person that does this professionally, there wasn't a great resource. So that was our focus. Our target audience is folks with their ATP. So we try and talk at that level, like we're talking to our colleague in the jump seat or in the FBO. So the conversations are sort of at that level. And we've just had a great time exploring a lot of topics, educational topics. How do I use weather radar? Career topics. We'll talk to a lot of career coaches. What kind of networking techniques should I use? Mm-hmm. Is this working on a resume? When should I put my application in at an airline? Or how do I negotiate a raise with my boss if I'm at a corporate operation? So those have a lot of traction. We have a lot of fun. We joke around a lot. We do an advice segment, and people foolishly write into us and ask us for advice. And we probably have about a 15% success rate on giving good advice. Sometimes it's very rewarding.
Great tips so far. I think, I bet you guys do great with that.
Sometimes it's rewarding. Sometimes to put our foot in our mouth. And I guess that's the downside of a podcasting. When you've done it for 5 years, you inevitably you're going to say things you regret. And that's just the way it is. But it's certainly been a great journey. I think, for us, again, like we talked about, timing is so important in aviation. Well, it turned out to be important in podcasting because we got going and sort of had the process up and running right when COVID hit. Uh-huh. And so we were all just sitting around with nothing to do. And we had microphones and, so you could make a lot of podcasts. That was easy. And so we all had, no haircuts and shaggy beards. And we're just, kind of shooting the breeze on these shows, trying to get something to stick. And so the popularity kind of took off from there, especially with so much uncertainty in the business. And so folks were worried they were going to lose their job. I mean, I imagine COVID was a challenge for you. Same thing. What's going to happen? No airplanes are moving. But, as a dispatcher and the scheduler, that's a real challenge, right?
It sure is. And for us, we lost a lot of business right at the beginning because being a shared service, it's a pay as you go. If you're busy, you get charged. If you're not, you don't get charged. And so,
right.
We lost a lot of revenue right there in the beginning. But then timing wise, it worked out well for us too. So we did, I don't know, it was probably about a year, I guess, that we were slower. But then it came back gangbusters because a lot of people had let their employees go because they weren't keeping them. Well, now they still needed the help, but they don't have the head count and they couldn't get the head count back. So timing wise, that did help us. We came out of the pandemic pretty strong there, which I was very grateful for. But it was a little bit quiet for a while there.
So when did you start aviation, Lindsay? When did you kind of get involved?
You're going to date me here. So I got my private license back in 94.
Okay.
So that was probably my first piece of it. And then I got my degree in aviation management, went into airline work, then I went into FBO work, then moved over to Part 91. And that's really where my niche is. I really like Part 91. And I've stayed in that realm ever since. So I guess I've been 25 years. I'm around 25 years.
And in those 25 years, how many black swans have we been through?
Oh my gosh.
3 at least?
Yeah, I was going to say 3
once in a lifetime catastrophes. I think that's the lesson for folks that are listening now. We got to change the term black swan, I think, because it's not a once in a lifetime event. It seems like we have a catastrophic event every 10 to 15 years.
And do you think that's different it's different in every industry, or do you think aviation is unique? And aviation, everybody really was affected 9/11.
Yeah.
But aviation was really affected. Pandemic also was really affected. But I guess other industries, they really were as well.
Yeah. It was, I think so much are tied to the financial markets. I think, you see contractions in credit and other things that really just slow down kind of the global marketplace in general. Yes, obviously 9/11 and COVID were very detrimental to aviation. They were like directly tied to aviation in certain ways. So to me, the lesson is it's going to happen again, probably at least 2 more times in my career, probably.
Yeah.
And
agreed.
And it's just like, I don't know if you watched any football over the weekend. The playoffs were going on, and there was one team that was in the lead, and then and then this other team had a comeback. And folks have a saying in football, which is the NFL stands for not for long. And I kind of think that's sort of the way aviation is, because it's wherever you're at, it just sort of seems like it's not going to be for very long. Oh, the airlines are hiring 1 million people. Oh, everyone's getting a job. Now, guess what? Southwest stopped hiring. Delta cut their numbers in half. Frontier's not hiring. And it doesn't happen slowly. It happens very quickly. And it seems like that's the way it is in aviation too, right? Can't get a training slot, can't get a simulator spot, can't find a pilot. Now it's the opposite. So it just seems like you're in for an exciting ride if you're in this in this space. It doesn't matter. All parts of aviation seems like gets touched, but you got to take the good with the bad in a way. And I think at the bottom of it, and I can tell just from talking to you, there you have to have that passion for aviation to want to stay in it for the long term, because otherwise it's going to be you're going to reach a point where you're going to say, I've had it. I'm ready to go somewhere else. Done
with this roller coaster. Yeah. No, I think you're right. And just being flexible, like we were talking about before, where you're networking, you've done all sorts of other outreach, you have the podcast, know that these things are coming. So have a diverse background so that you could do something else really quick, which I think is cool in business aviation. Like you said, there's so many different opportunities out there. So maybe you're not going to fly. Maybe you're going to swap to a different type of career. But in business aviation, it is good to have a backup or another route you could take.
Yep. Right. Side hustle.
Totally. Yep. Side hustle. That's awesome. Hey, Dylan, do you have any tips for maybe people? I'm sure that you guys talk about this on your podcast, but any other tips? We talked about networking, or maybe other books that people should read.
Yeah. If you're in the airline business and you're listening to this, you need to read the book Hard Landing. And that talks about, I think it's Thomas Petzinger Jr. wrote that. Basically talks about the airline industry, deregulation, a lot of that kind of stuff. A lot has changed. A lot is still the same. Basically what we're talking about, lots of ups and downs. That's probably not likely to change. Airlines will hire till they fire. It's just the way it goes. There's always going to be, labor and management strife there. That's what you're signing up for. Go read that book. It'll open your eyes to the way things are. Other piece of advice, anytime you're in aviation and people tell you, this is so good, this is the best it's ever been, look out, because that's when you're about to get hit by a train, I've found. But
yep.
That's you have the best timing. But, I think in general, and this is for folks in the business aviation realm, treat every opportunity to meet somebody in every relationship as something that it's like a small deposit you're making into a savings account. Mm-hmm. And we're putting it for a rainy day. And I don't want to make it sound like you're trying to monetize every relationship that you have, and it's just, for some means to an end. But be genuine in these relationships, but that it is of great value, and they will pay dividends later on. And you kind of never really know who you're going to run to in this business. It is a small world. So
you do not. It is a very small world. Yep.
Yeah.
Very small world. Okay. Before I let you go, I had one more thing that I wanted to talk to you about, and we talked a little bit about this before we started recording, but it's shared services. And your small flight department committee, I'm sure you guys talk about that. I'm part of the shared services. So how does that, in your job that you have now, how does that help run the flight department?
It's huge. So we're seeing a few things. Number one, I would say being a aircraft manager of a Part 91 airplane is probably the most pure and all-encompassing job there is in aviation, right? Because you sort of have to be an expert not an expert, but you have to have knowledge of many different aspects, right? Maintenance, dispatch, scheduling, not to mention interpersonal relationship with the principal, maybe some corporate structure stuff, how to translate things into business language, potentially. So there's a lot of finesse, there's a lot of knowledge involved. And in my experience, what I found is you kind of are that typical jack of all trades, master of none. And in some ways you can get away with that, but in a lot of ways that can really be dangerous, right? These airplanes now are so complex. There's just no way that the most pilots are going to be able to diagnose a lot of the maintenance issues, right? And so a shared service that we take advantage of, and a lot of folks do it, is they will hire a maintenance provider that may provide services on multiple aircraft. And so we can take advantage of a lot of economies of scale there and really tap into a lot of expertise that we normally wouldn't. For example, we have an avionics person on the team that maintains our airplanes. We have an engine specialist, we have airframe specialists, and we have people that are dedicated just into the paperwork and the library and all of those types of things. There's no way that a one airplane operation could really afford to, employ 9 maintenance technicians like that.
Right.
But when everyone pools their resources together, that's available. Same thing with scheduling and dispatching. Vendors are out there like yourself where you have that expertise. And I get that call that says, hey, we're going to Patagonia in 2 weeks. And there's no way I'm keeping up on Chilean airspace closures and, on all that kind of stuff. But now there are vendors that are out there and available that I can call. And maybe it's just a one-off thing. And I call you and I say, hey, we've got to do this trip. Can I hand the reins off? So I think the lesson is to be a great leader. A lot of times you have to understand how to hand key aspects off to the experts. And what's exciting is I don't think a lot of those opportunities were available 20 years ago.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
And now they are. So we have folks out there like yourself and your team who have a very specific set of expertise that we can lean on. And it doesn't mean that we have to lean on it every day, but in the times that we need it. And so that I think is really exciting. So again, it's sort of the theme of this entire conversation is sort of getting out of our silo and finding all these opportunities. What have you found kind of in this space? Is it a gradual adoption or are people kind of rushing towards this shared services? What do you think?
I think it was gradual, perhaps until we hit the pandemic timeframe. So we were pretty slow. So we're hitting our 10th year this year. And it was slow, at least for me. People were slow to grab the idea and run with it. But now I see it's faster and faster. And people are like, gosh, this is a great idea. I can hand off to you 5-10 hours a week. And then I can do what's more important for my part of the flight department. I think it's just going to get faster. And I think we're going to see more and more companies out there offering services like that. I see more maintenance companies out there. I definitely have had more people approach me and they're saying, hey, I'd like to do services like yours. Yeah, I think it's going to get faster here in the next 5 years, but it sure did feel like it lagged a little bit back in mid-2000s.
I think there's a generational aspect to that too. And working with sort of the previous generation, they wanted full control over everything for better or worse. And many of the chief pilots that I worked for in the past were incredible. They'd been doing it for their entire lives and they wanted full control because they knew they were the best person for that job. And I think as things change generationally, I think folks in my generation are more open to kind of recognizing outside expertise and kind of the value of that. And I think our industry was so different. I mean, I always love flying with pilots that have been around for a really long time. And I love to hear the stories about how they did it because it's so different. Like here, I'll give you a really good example. I know we're probably running over, but
no worries.
I just asked God the other day, we landed and I was like, 30 years ago, how did you know where to go eat? And how did you know where the hotel was? Like you had no phone, you didn't know. And it was funny because you fly with these people and it's like, well, I know there's an Applebee's, and they would go to these restaurants, but it was just, it was not because they thought the restaurant was that great, it's because they knew where it was. And that was really, the girl at the FBO desk told them that's it.
Yep.
And so it's kind of funny and now we take it for granted, right? Because now it's like, well, what does Dave Portnoy recommend is the best pizza place? And, and I can have all this information right in the palm of my hand. And it's such a completely different experience, but anyways, yeah. So
I think that's a great point about generation, though. You're right. It's changing. The generation, the newer people coming in, more accepting of these shared services, which is great for our industry. I really do think it's a need, and it really can complement a flight department.
The other thing is, too, I think principals now and aircraft owners are recognizing, for better or worse, I have all of my eggs in the chief pilot basket.
Mm-hmm.
And if this person leaves, man, we're stuck, and so that's a kind of a double-edged sword for pilots. It's nice to be loved and nice to be valued, but also, if you're the only one that's got all the maintenance logbooks locked up, no one else knows. That's a tough position to be in for an aircraft owner. So you kind of have to look at it from multiple perspectives.
And that kind of goes back to your comment before about how things are changing in terms of we used to want to keep all of it together. And now just in general, I would say all over in different industries, we're recognizing that we have to share this information. We don't need to keep it all to ourselves. Like, we don't need to be worried about losing our job if we don't do every single piece of this flight department or whatever industry you might be in. But I think that's an overall change in a thought process for all of us.
And I think that the reality is business jets are very popular right now. There is a tax on talent and bandwidth for folks, and there, for a lot of people are still the linchpin to a lot of these operations. And so it's how can we use these folks as efficiently as possible?
Yep. Very true. Very true. Well, Dylan, it has been so wonderful having you on the podcast with us today. So great, because it's nice to have a fellow podcaster. Of course, you've been doing this for a really long time, but it's wonderful to talk to you and hear about your stories. And if other people maybe wanted to find your podcast, reach out to you, where would we find you?
Sure. You can go to 215podcast.com. That's 21FIVE podcast.com. We're on all of the platforms, Spotify, Apple. My 8-year-old told me we're not on YouTube Music, so I got to work on that one. But so we'll be on there. But you could find us. We launch a show weekly, and it's a lot of fun. We love helping folks. The advice is mediocre at best, but we'll have a good time and we'll laugh along the way, at least. And so we certainly appreciate the opportunity to come on the show with you and salute the services that you provide to folks, especially in business aviation, because we need all the talent that we can get.
Well, thank you very much. Excellent. I will definitely post that website right down in the details here for people who are listening so they can go right straight to it. Thank you very much again, Dylan. This was great.
You bet, Lindsay.
Thank you for listening. Please stay tuned for more episodes and check out our website for up-and-coming podcasts. This has been a production of the Business Aviation Collective, sponsored by LD Aviation.